This is a conversation between Prism Reports as well as Debt Collective, the nation's first debtors union. And we are so blessed today because we have a bunch of different organizers that are here to talk about different types of household debt. So I think I'll go ahead and get started if that's cool with everybody. How y'all feeling? It's good to see everybody here. My name is Maddie Clifford, and I'm a writer, musician, as well as an abolitionist activist. I do a lot of different things, as you often have to do in the Bay Area in order to make ends meet. But one of my favorite things that I do is I work as part of a team of brilliant comrades, of organizers at the Debt Collective. And as I mentioned before, we are the nation's first debtors union. And so we organize around using our debts as leverage to push for cancellation and push for public goods to be available to the American people. And so I'm going to go ahead and just start us off with some introductions. We have some great panelists today. We're going to be talking about their work, about their stories, the stories that matter to them. So I was wondering if each panelist could just start off with your name, where you're from or where you're calling in from, and what is something interesting you learned this week about anything. Let's start off with Manuel. What's up, Manuel or Manny?
Hey everyone, I'm hoping y'all can hear me. There's actually a lot of students, but my name is Manuel Galindo. Most people call me Manny. We're based out of South Central Los Angeles and currently at a reentry resource fair at the Los Angeles Trade Technical College. So really busy over here, but glad to be here with everyone. And I am the Carceral Debt organizer for the Debt Collective, as well as a member of All of Us Are None. But yeah, really glad to be here.
Do you want to call on somebody to go next, or should I?
Oh, certainly. How about Gabrielle?
Hey y'all. Lord, my southern accent really coming out, ain't it? My name is Gabrielle Perry. I'm calling in from the greater New Orleans area. I'm born and raised Louisiana. The South gonna always hold it down. I am a formerly incarcerated woman. I am also an epidemiologist and a writer. And I'm also the founder and executive director of the Thurman Perry Foundation. We are a Louisiana-based nonprofit, though we do operate nationally in service to women and girls who've been impacted by incarceration. We provide scholarships to currently incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, and the daughters of anyone who's ever been incarcerated. We pay the rents and mortgages of formerly incarcerated pregnant women and mothers. And we also are the only organization in this country addressing menstrual equity and healthcare for incarcerated women. So we do the work at TPF. Oh, and something interesting I learned this week, a hippo's milk is pink. I didn't know that. Isn't that crazy? Maddie, pick somebody.
Okay. Lindsey, how about you go next?
Yeah, hey y'all, it's so good to be here. My name's Lindsey Muniak. I'm an organizer with the Debt Collective. Like Manny and like Maddie, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Baltimore on stolen Piscataway land. My organizing focuses on healthcare, and we look at the question of healthcare through this lens of medical debt, because it's one of the most concrete ways that the failures of our healthcare system, which is structured around profit, around building revenue, around expansion, not around care, despite the name. It's one of the most concrete ways it appears in people's lives. And so we see that as an opportunity to bring folks together to demand a truly public healthcare system and other public goods, and broadly debt abolition, carceral abolition, the things that all of us are here to fight for and to talk about. So really, really thrilled to be here. And oh, an interesting fact. I mean, I don't remember, since Gabrielle, I'm so glad that you went with an animal fact, because I was like, the thing that's popping in my head is an animal fact, and maybe, I don't know what the vibe will be, but I'm going for it. I don't know how deep it is, but I remember learning within the last couple of days that seals can dive like extraordinarily deep, despite being like, you know, animals that we see chilling on the surface of water. Like it's something insane. Like they can breathe or not breathe, they can hold their breath. extremely deep underwater, and it blew my mind. I also love seals, and I'll pass it over to Leonardo.
Hey everybody, it's really great to be here and great to be in conversation with so many great organizers across the country. My name is Leonardo. I'm from the Los Angeles Tenants Union. We organize around tenants issues regarding housing, but also just look at the subject of our struggle as tenants, not the housing. So we intersect a lot with like people's healthcare, with different systems of like the state that are like affecting people, like people's kids getting taken away and different things, the access to parks, the access to a good job and not being exploited there as well. We organize in tenant associations in different neighborhoods where tenants come together and discuss what kind of problems they're facing and work together to find solutions. From those tenant associations, we build locals in a certain neighborhood that try to elevate those politics that are very, very localized to a citywide level, to create change there. And we're also part of an autonomous tenant union network across the United States that is dealing around the right to housing, trying to make sure that tenants aren't getting harassed, that they aren't arbitrarily getting evicted or getting evicted at all. And most recently with the pandemic, people lost their jobs, had their hours cut, and came into a lot of debt because they weren't able to pay their rent. And when the pandemic started, we were calling for the cancellation of rent. And we were able to use the state rental aid program to have millions of dollars of that debt essentially erased. But we're still fighting because there's still some debt, and we're still fighting because landlords continue to have a debt with us in terms of like the bad conditions that we've been living for years, while paying rent every single month. One thing that I learned, it's crazy because I actually just came back from Venezuela. We were there for 10 days as a tenants union. And over there, it was just really crazy to see that the government had built 4.4 million homes in the last 13 years. Homes for people who were victims of ecological like devastation or like crises, and for the most poor of the whole country.
Thank you so much. So as you can tell, the people that are here, they are experts and they bring so much understanding and experience about different debt types. So folks that are joining the call, each person is kind of focusing on a different debt type, from carceral debt to rent debt to student loan debt. I'm here representing student loan debt. There's a lot going on in that space, or medical debt. So my first question that I want us all to like think about is, what is one misconception about debt that you have, since organizing, started to unpack? And you could probably focus on your debt category, but you can talk about any type of household debt. And I'll start us off. So as folks know, this collaboration is actually part of an essay, a series of different essays that look at different debt types. And I think for me, one of the biggest misconceptions that I learned was this idea that my debt, my student loan debt, which has reached over $120,000, is a personal failure. That was something, a misconception that I believed for many years. I thought that, I made these really bad personal decisions. I should feel ashamed. I rarely talked about it. And if I did, I often burst into tears. And then I started to learn, especially by joining a debtors union and also just talking to my friends and my community members, I started to realize, wait a second, this isn't just affecting me. This is affecting 1 in 5 Americans. Student loan debt affects 1 in 5 Americans. And I started to realize, I actually started to ask a question: is this a personal failure or is this a systemic failure? And I realized it's a systemic failure. I wrote in my essay about, we're told and we're taught to avoid financial landmines. So we don't ask the question, why am I walking on a minefield? Right? Why is it so difficult to pay my rent, to pay for my medical care? And why are people being, punished after being punished through the carceral system? And so this is one of the misconceptions that I learned. So whoever would like to answer this question, or I could ask someone and specifically, actually, Gabrielle, if you don't mind, I want to ask you specifically, what's one common misconception that people have about debt?
From my lane of expertise, for sure, because in any room that I'm in, I'm always representing women impacted by incarceration. It's that when you are incarcerated, everything is paid for by the state, that it's like a free ride. We're all hanging out, you know, and these people are just being funded by the state. That could not be more of a lie. In fact, in terms of all of our areas of expertise, you can incur many different kinds of forms of debt while you are incarcerated. You can incur, in fact, I think the most common type of debt that people do incur is medical debt. And I speak from personal experience. My birth mother, who gave me away at birth due to an impending conviction in the state of Texas for a drug charge, ended up giving me away, serving a very long sentence in the state of Texas, and was given compassionate release due to developing cancer while she was incarcerated. And due to a very, very lengthy lawsuit that we filed against the state of Texas, which we did later on win, before we were even able to settle with the state, her medical fees incurred while she was incarcerated had to be repaid through the settlement. So these things will follow you upon release. Like they go with you everywhere. There's even in the student debt conversation, and especially because we at TPF, every single year we run the Perry Second Chances Scholarship, and people always ask me why we open that scholarship to currently incarcerated women. And it's because they go to school too. 38% of prisons in this country do offer educational resources to the people that they have incarcerated there. And there's a reason why people are celebrating that Pell Grant is now being offered once again to those who are incarcerated, because you can incur debt for your education while you are incarcerated. You pay co-pays for your health care. You have to pay for all of these things. This is not some kind of a free ride or any kind of anything that they can extract from you as a person, that they can extract from the community possibly supporting you. Anything they can take from you while you are incarcerated will absolutely be exploited. So nothing is free while you are incarcerated.
That's such an important point. And I think one of the things that I've started to learn, especially about carceral debt, and I'm going to ask you a question too, Manny, about this, is that I think people don't understand that debt is essentially about punishment. And that's what makes carceral debt such a key point of reference, because it's like you're getting punished and then you're getting punished again. So Manny, I was wondering if you could answer that question too, some misconceptions about debt in general, but carceral debt in particular, perhaps.
Yeah. I think one thing that people aren't aware of is that they assume that all the debt is owed to the government. Like there's this misconception that carceral debt is something that you pay to the state because someone's incarcerated. But the more you dig, the more you find out that in actuality, the state actually contracts third-party corporations to come in and handle everything from probation to the food that gets served to the commissary or canteen while you're incarcerated. All that is controlled by private entity and private equity firms who look at the fact that there's always people funneling in and out of jails as a way to maintain and build profit for private corporations. And there's actually a large portion of private entities attached into almost every aspect of the mass incarceration system.
Wow, thank you so much for bringing that up. And then I was wondering if Leonardo, anything that you want to share as well in terms of the housing aspect and things that people don't understand about rent debt, for example.
Yeah, I think along with punishment, I mean, the rent debt and rent in general is all about exploitation and extraction from people's wages. It's just like horrible to think about like how tenants are like thinking every day and every week about the amount of hours that they have to pay just so that they can pay rent the next month right after having paid rent the month before. So it's always a matter of like getting you to work more, to getting you to miss time with your family, to sacrifice a meal because now you have a rent increase, or now the landlord's making you pay for insurance, or making you pay for water charges or a new parking spot. So it's always a way to just like extract a little bit more from you. And people have to make these calculations every day. It's like, okay, well, you know, I can't pick up my son or daughter early today because I have to put in 4 more hours so that I can just make it to get the rent. And then the rest will be, you know, to buy food and stuff. Also, I mean, just thinking too about like this like system and this capitalist system and the history, right? There's a debt that supposedly is imposed on us that's like yeah, made to feel very personal. But there's also this historic debt that the government and capitalism and the state and all these like bosses and landlords have with us. Centuries of slavery, all the imperialism that's caused immigration to these countries, all those things have put us into this precarious position every day that now in the contemporary times is being taken advantage of to take more out of us.
That's such a great analysis. And I was wondering, Lindsey, if you wanted to speak on that as well. I think that people might not know how many Americans owe medical debt. I think it's reached 100 million people.
Yeah, this is something that is really important to highlight, I think, especially because so many people feel deeply ashamed of their debt. They feel like it's a sign of, Maddie, as you were saying, like a personal moral failure. And one of the things that we've realized over time through a lot of organizing, and part of the kind of like theory at the center of the Debt Collective's organizing project, is that part of building this kind of power for people who are struggling with debt, which is like the vast majority of people in our current, racial capitalist system, are actually unaware that other people are in the same position, right? And so that part of getting to somewhere different, part of building that struggle, building that fight, is building solidarity, resisting shame, helping people understand that debt is serving a function, and it's not a failure on their part that they've accumulated it. It's built into the very way that the system is structured. And I was thinking, Maddie, just about this question of like something that a lot of folks don't recognize or think about in relation to debt. I was thinking about how many spaces I'm in where financial management advice is pitched as a solution to these different debt crises, right? So we have this massive medical debt crisis, as you were saying, Maddie. The estimates from a survey that tried to kind of like capture the true amount that was done by the Kaiser Family Foundation last year is like over 40% of American adults, over 100 million Americans. Like that is staggering. That's about a third of the country. But one of the solutions that is always being put out, and I'm sure this is true in these other debt spaces too, is this financial management course model. It's also a criticism that's leveraged at debtors for financial management. And in response to that kind of proposal, the thing that I always ask is like, what level of financial management is going to allow someone to budget for an unexpected $25,000 bill, $10,000 bill, hell, $500 bill, right? They're like, or less medical bill. How do you budget for that? Especially in an economic like moment where like real wages aren't increasing. Austerity has meant that like we've just stripped public services, public goods to the bone. There's no way that you can budget for things that cost this much from an economic position that isn't one of extraordinary wealth and privilege. And it's so important, I think, for people to think about that. This isn't a question of like getting the right financial advice. It's a system that sets you up to fail.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I wanted to go back to the carceral debt again, because I feel like it speaks so much to the punishment aspect and the punishing aspect of debt itself. And I was wondering, I wanted to go to Manny first, and then we're going to go to Gabrielle. But I wanted you to talk a little bit, Manny, about in your piece, you told a personal story about the way that mass incarceration has essentially made your community into like a cage. And I really love this metaphor. And I was wondering if you could kind of explain the ways, like what is carceral debt exactly, and the ways that you've actually used carceral debt as leverage to fight for cancellation.
Well, I'll say I have a working definition for carceral debt, because every time I talk to someone new, there's a new perspective or a new way of looking at it. So let's call it carceral debt or criminal legal debt. But I define it as any form of debt due to a person's involvement with the criminal legal system. And generally, I break it into 4 categories, which is pretrial debt, meaning any type of debt created prior to someone seeing a judge. So that's like immigration bonds, bail bonds, even everything from like parking tickets can be considered pretrial debt. Then there's carceral debt, which is while I'm incarcerated, which tends to be like canteen, commissary, medical copays, even attorney fees can constitute that. Then you get the reentry debt. So this is when an individual is leaving incarceration, but they now have to pay for ankle monitor service fees, drug and alcohol testing, family reunification classes, all kinds of other fees associated with just the reentry part. And the fourth category I call shadow debt, or anyone could call it whatever. But the idea there is that there is all types of debt that are associated with an individual's life that isn't directly related to the incarceration, but is impacted by, right? So like oftentimes many people being incarcerated are mothers or fathers of children. So they can have auto title loan debt, they can have mortgage debt, they can have rent debt, they have all types of other debt that they've accrued in order to basically have their basic needs met that are now impacted because of that one individual's incarceration. So that's generally the 4 different categories that I break it down to. But like I said, it's a working definition, and I'm glad to work with anyone on developing it out more. But to your earlier point about how that looks like in my community, well, I don't know how it looks like to y'all, but when I first left Los Angeles was the first time someone told me that, I don't know if you realize that there aren't any bars on your windows to every one of your homes, or there isn't a metal door blocking your wooden door that everyone locks every single point at night, or there aren't these massive metal fences protecting your home from people coming in and out. In fact, my own high school had 10-foot tall metal fences with spikes pointing inwards, and I always question why. If the idea was to keep people out, why are we being forced to stay in when I see all over the country kids get to leave from like to lunch to go to like restaurants or their homes? Not for us. We weren't allowed. Another aspect of my high school, how mass incarceration impacted that. If I wanted to play, I played volleyball. If I wanted to play my local high school, we had to get bussed in, and there was a metal fence that had a black tarp so that people couldn't look inside. And a police officer had to walk with a drug-smelling dog through the bus before we were allowed to exit on to play the game. That's just another aspect, right? Bail bond agencies exist all over my neighborhood. So much so that me and my friends laugh at some of the names, because there's like a Batman bail bonds, a Gotham bail bonds, lipstick bail bonds. There's all kinds of ridiculous names for these services that are all related to the mass incarceration industry. And they just so happen to pop up everywhere in my neighborhood, to the point where people assume that it's a natural part of life. But then the minute you leave South Central Los Angeles, you see that there's all forms of things that don't exist in our community. In fact, I actually Googled like yesterday to see what a food desert was in my community. I cannot find organic food within a 5-mile radius of my home. I have to leave my immediate city to find fresh food. Even the local farmers market that used to exist doesn't exist anymore. In fact, after the '92 uprising that happened here in Los Angeles, majority of the private industries like Nike, McDonald's, basically up and left my community. And so a lot of what you see in my community is kind of the leftovers of what private corporations left after people started figuring out that we didn't like this system. So for me, when I look at like how mass incarceration has impacted my community, I look at the fact that I live in what's considered one of the most incarcerated neighborhoods of the entire country. And I look at the fact that most of my community members are afraid to even speak to a police officer. And that's just, I could keep going on and on and on, but I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, I think I'll come back to you to talk about how specifically you're leveraging debt to fight back against a lot of these corporations. Gabrielle, I want you to speak to how every debt type disproportionately affects women. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your own personal experiences with how carceral debt disproportionately impacts women and some of the work that you're doing around that.
Manny, you lit a fire to me as soon as you talked about pre-child debt, because that's the debt that's so slept on in that conversation. And honestly, that is honestly the debt that really primarily affects women in the carceral system: pre-trial debt, and then the debt you incur upon release. Because the majority, and people don't know this because they don't know how jails and prisons and the carceral system itself functions. So the majority of women who are incarcerated in jails in this country are legally innocent. They have not been convicted of a crime. They are being held on cash bail bonds and whatnot. They are legally innocent. And the fees that you incur while you are in jail or while you are pre-trial can be astronomical. For myself, I remember trying to quantify it on Twitter one day in preparation for this event. I remember paying $10,000 restitution, of course, but there were so many fees, hundreds of dollars, probably thousands of dollars in fees for pretrial diversion programs and classes I had to take, ordered by the judge in the year that I was on probation. And it was just so much. And then I always talk to people about what I incurred when the whole situation was over for me, in terms of essentially having to buy my freedom back through the expungement process. I live in the state of Louisiana. The state of Louisiana is a majority female state. 49% of the state of Louisiana has a criminal record. We in Louisiana incarcerate the most people per capita, more than the US average, more than any other state, more than all of our NATO allies. And the way this has played out for women is a continued cycle of poverty. And that debt is so real, because even upon release, I mean, you're more likely as a formerly incarcerated woman, I think you're 2 times more likely to be homeless than a formerly incarcerated man. You are more likely to be or underemployed than a man. Women who are on probation or parole make up to about 30% less than men who are on probation or parole. And so you're navigating all these things on top of the gender pay gap that we all are facing, on top of sexist employment discrimination that we all face in the general population. But that added carceral discrimination just keeps you trapped, in addition to the fact that whatever debt you owed while you were incarcerated, you still have to pay that back. And you also have to pay to be on parole and probation. You pay a fee for that. And women pay higher fees to be on probation and parole than men do. So it all circles back to this. And I think the biggest criticism that I get in terms of what my organization is doing to address this problem, because the way is that we're just throwing money at a problem. Yeah, we're throwing money at a problem because that is the problem. And I remember being so relieved that the judge on my case had mercy on me. I actually did an interview with him on CBS Morning News with Gail King and David Begnaud. And I remember him saying that, this was a crime of survival. I was trying to eat. I was trying to take care of my elderly disabled mother, who's not really my only family in this world. And he saw that and he let me go. He let me go. And people couldn't believe that, because we associate crime as a moral failing, as opposed to a response to a system that has been built to trap all of us. 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record. And yet all of us who have criminal records, especially women, there's a feeling of isolation amongst all of us, even for the ones who are incarcerated with other women, that it's never been as bad as it happened to me. It's never that nobody's ever experienced this, or that I'm just the worst person in the world. There's this isolation that you feel that keeps people from really asking why the world is the way that it is. And it also keeps people trapped in that cycle of recidivism, because what are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do when these debts and these fees mount up? I paid $3,000 to multiple entities that have to talk to each other in a very specific sequence at a very specific time frame in order to get my criminal record expunged and buy back my reputation, buy back my life. And I did that with the lawsuit money from my mother's death incurred by her own incarceration. That is the generational impact of incarceration for women.
Wow. So I'm just finger snapping on everything you and Manny are saying. It's so on point and it's so key. And one of the things that I really learned being part of a debtors union was Hannah Appel, who's one of the founders of the Debt Collective. She talked to me about abolition, and abolition isn't just imagining a world without things like without police and prisons, but it's also imagining a world with the public goods that we deserve, right? So housing, healthcare, school lunch, all of the things that currently have become things that we cannot access without going into debt. And so you both are speaking on that key issue there, and how abolition is so intertwined with debt abolition. I mean, they're both abolition, right? And I was wondering if we could go to Leonardo now, because as everyone can tell from this conversation, there is a lot to talk about, even within each debt type. We could have a whole 1 hour conversation on each debt type. But I want to talk now about how we can actually connect with each other, how we can build solidarity. Just like Gabrielle was saying, debt often makes us feel isolated and makes us feel like it's punishing towards ourselves, right? One of the best ways to oppress a people, right, is to get them to oppress themselves. So I was wondering, Leonardo, if you could talk about your organizing with tenants, and how, especially I loved in your piece where you talked about a mariachi and his personal experience of like being evicted and his equipment being taken, his instruments, and how afraid he was. And then he joined the tenants union and it like all changed for him. Could you tell us a little bit about your work that you've been doing with tenants?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, on the question of like abolition and the lack of something, but how we as communities can build something, how we can build community relationships to you know to replace those systems that basically exploit and put us in precarious positions. In the last 26 years of the Los Angeles Tenants Union and our local, we've always been working to build relationships with neighbors, to find out what's going on in the community, to realize our own collective power, to say, okay, well, there's a lot of shootings, or there's a lot of graffiti, or we can't talk to our kids. How do we approach that? Specifically, there's one corner in our neighborhood where the community does a weekly cleanup there. They put in a stoplight because the kids and families were like having to like dodge cars every day. And so these are kind of like the things that set the groundwork for us to build a lot of relationships to address the crisis of gentrification and housing that began to affect us in 2015. Before we were a community organization, but then we started seeing how many evictions were taking place in our neighborhood, the onslaught of like galleries, coffee shops, breweries, and bars that were coming to our neighborhood, and how landlords were taking advantage of this to say, okay, I'm tired of renting to poor low income immigrant tenants, and I want to start renting to white professional tech people who make 2, 3, 4 times and can pay 2, 3, 4 times their rent. So in the case here of the mariachis, this was a building that was just 2 blocks away from this like cultural center in our neighborhood called Mariachi Plaza. And the landlord decided to all of a sudden change the name of the building to Mariachi Crossings, but at the same time evict all the mariachis that live there. Mariachis who needed to be close to the center to make their lives, to have a job and to work. And so, just the irony, right, of just like appropriating the name but wanting to evict everybody out of there. Luckily, we were able to form the Los Angeles Tenants Union, bring everybody together, and stop these like mass evictions of all these tenants. And since then, we've been working, and mariachis have been a primary victim of this a lot of the times. In the story and the piece that we're talking about, this was a guy who runs a bar downstairs, caters to like more like hipster, like artist people, and wants to bring more of those kinds of people into the neighborhood. And so the mariachi who lived in the building above, he was essentially one day he just came, grabbed all of his instruments, changed the lock of his door, and kicked him out. We were able to come together with bolt cutters and with like a handsaw, and we were able to get him back into his apartment. We were able to get him back in 3 times because the landlord just kept on pestering and kept on harassing and violently kicking this tenant out. Like you're saying, Maddie, every single time it happened, the morale was very, very low. But when we pulled up with 20, 30, 40 people, you could see that there was power in the union, power in being together, and power in not standing back and saying, okay, he must be a victim. This must have just happened to him. Must be his own fault. And saying, no, this is a moral thing that's very, very wrong. And we as a community have the power to put him back into his home and make sure that this doesn't happen to any tenant or anybody in our neighborhood ever again.
Yes, I love it. So that's the power of tenant unions. And so we're talking right now about all these different debt types and ways to organize and actually use our debt as leverage. And I think that sometimes can be a confusing and complicated concept, but essentially it's about having solidarity. So going from thinking of debt as a personal failing, as I talked about before, and understanding that it's a policy failure, and saying, not only can't I pay this back, but I won't pay this back. And so I was wondering, Lindsey, if you could go next. In your piece, we talked about how medical debt in particular could be likened to like a boa constrictor, or something that people don't realize is affecting them because they're using like credit cards to pay. So could you talk a little bit about the uniqueness of medical debt, as well as how you are fighting back against these big hospitals and corporations that are benefiting off of our lack of healthcare?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one place to start with this maybe is by sort of highlighting the way that Maddie, because you just mentioned fighting back against hospitals, and I think we're working to kind of build the struggle against all of the kind of major healthcare industries, so hospitals, insurance companies, pharma companies, and I think they're all terrible. They're all as these sort of infrastructures designed to extract and literally killing people all the time. But hospitals have emerged as like our sort of like initial target, in part because of just the tremendous contradiction between their stated mission and what they're actually doing in relation to the people that they're claiming to care for, to the patients. And I wrote in the piece a bit about nonprofit hospitals and the way that this sort of term nonprofit, and this is true with education too, of course, the term nonprofit can really be misleading here, right? Because we're talking about organizations that are kind of presenting this nonprofit narrative that they're doing charity work, that this justifies these just enormous tax exemptions, subsidies, like spaces for reimbursement that they're receiving from the government at various levels, as as a function of their claim to be providing this public good to people, when they're actually sending patients to debt collectors at extremely short periods after they've received care, sending patients who should be receiving free care to debt collectors, even where it's very easy to determine that they should be receiving this financial assistance that is used in part to justify these tax exemptions, and often suing patients and pursuing them for wage garnishments, sending them to court for like requesting liens on their homes. I mean, it's an incredibly aggressive practice, and we're talking here, about healthcare. That's usually, when you have these big bills, it's usually because they're accrued during a moment of health crisis. And so when people are in this period where what they really need is a chance to heal, and are, of course, receiving, in most cases, also pressure from their employers. When are you going to get back to work? Feeling this kind of enormous stress, like across the board. How am I going to pay rent? How am I going to pay these hospital bills? Hospitals threatening to send me to collections. How am I going to put food on the table? How am I going to make sure that I don't lose my car, that it doesn't get repoed? These questions just compound and compound and compound. And so, I mean, one of the reasons that I think it's so important to be having this conversation where we're speaking across these debt types is because they're so interrelated. And like when I wrote about this, like a constricting snake, it was thinking about what it feels like, because I've been there, and I think the folks who I know well on this panel have certainly been there. It feels like you're just trying to get your head above water, and everything that you do in order to get your head above water is just pushing you further down, adding weights to your legs. It gets harder, you fall behind on rent because you're trying to pay off your hospital bills. Now you're facing eviction too. You take out a new line of credit, and then your credit score is too bad to get an auto loan. And it just, these are so intersecting, and And it really is a system that's just squeezing people, poor and working class people, and disproportionately Black and Brown people across all of these spheres of their life. And yeah, I think, you know, Maddie, your question about like how we're organizing people, it really starts with, because there's so much shame, because we're not going to have like a spontaneous mass uprising of debtors, because people have been made to feel like it's this shameful thing. It's meant to be isolating. It starts by having conversations with folks who are struggling and finding ways to offer immediate support at the level of like an ear, someone to talk to, and also at the level of like a resource that can connect them to different avenues of like relief. And one of those avenues of relief, I think, like our argument here is, and this is what like distinguishes all of us here in our work from work that like a direct service nonprofit might do. We believe that like one of those avenues of relief, in addition to the more traditional ones, is solidarity. And so that's like part of the task, is not only connecting people with financial assistance applications, finding ways to help them file those. For instance, in this case, I'm thinking about medical debt that's owed to hospitals, but also letting them know as you're talking with them, like, hey, you know, this hospital got $1 billion in tax breaks last year. You know, they were actually supposed to give you free care, and it's being used to justify those tax breaks that are just going to executive salaries, going to expansions, et cetera. So like doing a little bit of political education on the spot to help folks understand that this isn't their fault. You know, this is intentional. It's by design. There's not one evil person executing it, right? This is like how capitalism works, but it is by design. It's built into the structure. And then saying, hey, you know, I've been in this situation. How would you like to find some time to talk with others who have too? You know, would that help you feel a little better? You mentioned that you're ashamed, you don't want to tell your sister about this, or that you don't feel like you can tell your parents because you're going to be stressing them out and they're elderly. Would you want to join us in this space to talk about that experience, you know, and like finding these ways. I mean, I'm sort of like condensing things for time, but finding these opportunities to bring people whose interests are totally aligned as debtors, but who don't realize it because they're understandably afraid. They're being pursued by debt collectors, they're being threatened with eviction by landlords, et cetera. To help them understand that actually there are way more people in this situation than what you're imagining. And imagine if we seized that power, if we saw ourselves as like a united front. And I think that's the sort of like, that's the organizing project. That's how we're building the debtors union. It's, you know, like all organizing that is trying to really build a struggle, it's hard work, but I think it's absolutely critical. It's the only way that we start to really build the power to overturn these systems that we're talking about.
Right, because at the end of the day, our debts are someone else's assets. And when I started to think about that, I started to be like, wow, even if I have the means someday to pay off some of my student loans, I refuse to pay because these loans are predatory in nature and they shouldn't exist. Folks that often ask me, you know, a lot of people are talking about the student debt strike. What are we going to do next? People often want cookie cutter answers to complex problems, essentially. And what I tell them, the first thing I say is like, join the union. The reason we have a union, a debtors union, is because we're able to work with each other. We're able to gain expertise from legal experts, folks that have 10, 20 years of experience, and we're constantly figuring out different ways to fight back. But it really starts with the solidarity. I think people just want like this really quick fix. And it's like, no, this is someone else's assets. These are rich people's assets. And there are people with billions and billions of dollars that are working around the clock to figure out how to keep us in debt. And so in order for us to fight back, I believe we will win, and I'm fighting to win. The first thing that needs to happen is we need to work together. And so one of the things I did when I first decided I was never going to pay back my student loans was I thought about what are the skills that I have and how can I contribute those skills to the movement? And that's how I first started working with the Debt Collective. And there's so much to talk about just within the student debt space, but I just want to say a couple things that are happening and ways that we're fighting back. You know, many people have been in response to the recent Supreme Court ruling against Biden's student debt relief plan. And we at the Debt Collective, since day one, have been urging Biden to use his executive authority through the Higher Education Act of 1965, for example, to cancel all federal student loan debt. Some people don't understand that the federal government owns student loan debt, and so they can choose not to collect on a debt that they own. So in some ways, it seems complicated, but it's actually not complicated. It's simple. And that's why we need to continue to fight. We need to continue to demand full student debt cancellation, because college should be free for everyone, and college and education is something that we should invest in as a society. One important aspect too of the Debt Collective is we're not just about canceling the debt, right? As I talked about before, abolition is the presence of something, right? The presence of housing, the presence of education, the presence of healthcare. And so we need to also push for college for all, for healthcare for all, et cetera. And so I was just wondering if a couple people, I know we don't have a ton of time, but I was wondering if each of you could just speak to something, because we've talked a lot about the problem. The problem feels massive, but also the people, I believe in the people, right? And I was wondering if each of you could just mention at least one or two things that you have been doing to fight back against these types of debts. So I know there's a tenant power toolkit that is available, as well as a cancel my bail debt tool. So if each of you could speak to that a little bit, what you've been doing to fight back. We'll start with Manny, then go to Gabrielle, Leonardo, and then end with Lindsey, if that's cool.
Yeah, so yeah, cancelmybaildebt.org, right? The actual framework they used to develop it actually came from a few years of organizing in California with different advocates, attorneys, and organizers. And the toolkit developed using a legal framework that only applies at the moment in California. But the way it works is we identify the different ways in which a bail agency has violated your California consumer California consumer rights. And then we submit a dispute letter that highlights and identifies the different violations as a way to advocate for the cancellation of debt. We then ask anyone who joins us through the use of the toolkit to work with us to challenge other aspects of the criminal legal system, because we found that bail debt, to Gabrielle's point earlier, is just the start of a major problem. And so if we get people as early as the bail situation involved in this fight, we could ultimately see massive change for the entire system as we move forward. So yeah, if you guys can, please go to the cancelmybaildebt.org and check it out.
Thank you. Gabrielle, did you want to go next?
I'll go next. So for us, I mentioned that how carceral debt kind of intersects everywhere for incarcerated women, but I think one place that we try to address it and where people can kind of start is our Girl Code initiative. I mentioned briefly that the Thurman Perry Foundation, my nonprofit, is the only organization in this country that's addressing menstrual equity for incarcerated women. And so what that means is essentially that there are 38 states that have no laws that say that incarcerated women have to be provided something as simple as menstrual products while they are incarcerated. And so because the average incarcerated woman, I think at least in my state anyway, is making anywhere from 4 cents to 40 cents an hour and might be given like 2 tampons the start of the month to rock with, maybe, and then be told, hey, if you need some more, go ahead and pay $20 at the commissary for a box of shitty ones. That is a means of incurring debt. And so we have tried to eliminate that. We started our Girl Code initiative. It's about to be 2 years in this September. We are a small but mighty organization. We have served over 3,000 women in 2 states. We have donated 145,599 organic menstrual products to incarcerated women throughout the state of Louisiana and some in Texas. But I always tell people that program shouldn't even exist. My nonprofit should not exist. These things should not have to be done. So we are so grateful to first be able to endorse Congresswoman Grace Ming's Menstrual Equity for All Act, which, should it pass, ensure that women who are incarcerated in local jails and state prisons be afforded the opportunity to have menstrual products, something as simple as that. And then we are also working with Period, the menstrual movement, which is the largest menstrual equity organization in the entire world, I believe, to work on publishing a curriculum that will be out this fall in time for Period Action Day, National Pad Day, that will be able to kind of help people understand what menstrual equity is, what it is for incarcerated women, and how you guys can help in your individual states. When we first started this, especially in big bad Louisiana, everybody, all the sheriffs, all the carceral system people stick together. We were just like, hey, y'all do what y'all do. We trying to do what we do. We just want to help these women. And it's as simple as that. And so we've been able to maintain a really good working relationship just to be able to help these women. Like, that's my only goal. I don't care about anything except helping these women. And if you want to help us help these women, feel free to go to thurmanperryfoundation.org. That's THURMAN Perry, PERRY foundation.org, and learn more about it.
Thank you. So I want to shout out the abolish rent. I want to shout that out. I want to make sure also that I answer some questions. As many of y'all know, this topic we could spend an hour on each debt type. So this has been a very, very difficult undertaking, but you all have done a fantastic job. I want to answer some of the questions in the chat. So we have one question that's, I'm curious how credit card debt and the extractive industry of credit card companies plays into the debt abolition conversation. I feel like sometimes the weight of credit card debt is emphasized as a massive personal failure when so frequently it is actually a result of class struggles. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on how that integrates. I was wondering if Lindsey, could you answer that question possibly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think absolutely credit card debt is like a site of struggle here. And so aligned, I mean, not even aligned, it is these other debt types too, right? Like it's one of the issues with having lines of credit, often with really high interest rates, that are presented as solutions to accruing these like massive debts that we can't pay. Well, you can pay, you just put it on this card, and then it's no longer possible to pursue some of the same protections, at least in the case of medical debt, that you're entitled to when something is medical debt owed to a provider, because it's credit card debt. And I mean, just speaking, like, this is my own experience with medical debt, was putting copays and deductibles on credit cards for years in my early 20s when I was really sick, and racking up $24,000 of credit card debt that to me was credit card debt, and that I felt additional shame about, right? Because people have this fantasy that everyone's just running around and, like, I don't know, buying first class tickets or something when they have credit card debt. But like you say, it's in this question, like it really is a matter of survival for the vast majority of people who have credit card debt as like members of the poor and working class. It's something where people are using credit cards to buy groceries and to pay medical bills, to ensure that they can talk to their loved ones who are incarcerated, or that, or vice versa. So I think credit card debt, I mean, it's trickier to navigate insofar as there are different legal protections that are available to like people with rent debt, with medical debt, that aren't there for folks with credit card debt. But I think all of us across our campaigns are working on that question and building it in to these individual campaigns, right? It's like, for me, from my position, like, if you have put medical bills on a credit card, that is medical debt. It might not legally be, but that's medical debt. It's unjust debt, and you shouldn't feel any differently about it than if it were a bill that you owe to the hospital. So I'm really happy that you raised this question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think credit card debt really masks a lot of these other debt types, from carceral debt to rent debt. We have another question. Do you have any recommendations for not paying student loan debt, since loan holders can garnish wages up to 15% of federal loans and 25% for private? Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so one of the main things that we really want to reiterate in the Debt Collective is that to strike student loan debt doesn't automatically mean to default. Although it's important to also understand that defaulting student loan debt is something that's already happened. So before the pause on student loan payments, one person was defaulting paying on their student loans every 25 seconds. Right. So we know that people are going, when they're threatening to lift the pause on student loan payments in August, when that happens, people are going to have to decide between paying their rent and paying their student loans, between paying for medical bills or paying their student loans. Right. And we know that people are going to be forced into default. And we also understand that default affects different people in different ways. It can lead to wage garnishment. It has all these different, credit score being lowered, things like that. And we understand it might not be the option for everyone, but we actually have a list of many different ways to strike. And so it's important to understand that striking student debt we consider anyone striking student debt, anyone who is trying to get to as close to 0 monthly payments as possible. And there are actually a number of ways to do that. And that's why I often reiterate when people ask me this question to join our union, to come to the organizing calls, because it's different to fight back against the federal government when it comes to federal student loan debt, because the federal government doesn't need our student loan payments. So it's essentially about saying to ourselves and having solidarity, as we talked about before, that not only can't we pay the debt, but we won't pay the debt. And so joining our union and talking to other organizers and getting that information is going to ensure that you have the collective solidarity with other people to make sure that you don't ever make another student loan payment again. So that's like my short answer to, again, something that can sometimes be complex. Another thing I want to let folks know is that we actually have a book at the Debt Collective that we put out called Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. And that book is not only actually really easy to read and it's short, but it really breaks down all of the things that we've been talking about in this call. And it's a really good way to just get yourself educated as someone that hopefully will join the debt abolition movement. So if anyone has any other questions, you can feel free to put them in the chats. And I also want to just again thank Prism Reports. Prism Reports is an incredible news reporting organization, and you can find them online, prismreports.org. And I'm so grateful for them to work with me as a contributing editor to get these stories out there to the general public. I really appreciate that. And also, I just want to thank all of the panelists. I know that sometimes the work that we're doing, it's not always visible. And that's why I just cherish moments like this where we can make the work visible. We talked about all the things that we're up against, but I really truly believe our love for one another is more powerful than all the systems conspiring against us. And I know that each and every one of you is moving from a place of love. And that's why I just really appreciate you all so much. So thank you all for being here. Is there anything else anyone else would like to say or share? Feel free.
Just thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you, Maddie, for facilitating this great conversation.
Thank you. Also, Can't Pay, Won't Pay is also an ebook that you can download for free from Haymarket Books. So you can actually just get the book for free. I promise you it's good.